Chickasaw National Park Encounter by Harleen Quinzel. I was 20 years old, and I had left home when I was 16 years old, and decided to explore the world to see what I could find. I had been raised in Texas and Louisiana, but I had been raised in Louisiana for the most part. I decided to go back for a little bit. I went from Missouri to New York, California, anywhere in the United States I could have decided to go. And finally, I decided to go home. Well, up until I had been staying in Oklahoma, when I received a phone call from my mom saying that she might be dying of cancer. But I came to find out later that she actually wasn't. She just wanted me home. Well, I was hitchhiking through Oklahoma and was near the Chickasaw National Park. In 2 days, I haven't been able to catch a ride. Sticking out my thumb, doing all that, nobody stopped. So I said, oh well, and pitched a tent in the national park. I decided to explore some, so I followed the paved road until I got to a camping area, and there was a fire pit off a little ways from the road, and it was a clear area. There were picnic tables, so I decided that's where I was going to camp that night. I decided to explore a little bit, and followed a deer trail into the woods. As I was walking, I happened to look to my left on the ground, and there was a hawk laying there with no head, as if it had been burnt off. An eerie feeling came over me, but I just brushed it off as me being paranoid. I already had some paranormal experiences, but never came across one where it involved animals. So I walked away and went back to the area that I had decided to pitch my tent. That night, I sat there until it started getting dark, and I set my tent up. I left the tent flap open because it was a very cool afternoon. Finally, night came, and the street lamps that were along the paved road came on. The lights were actually bright enough to where I could actually read a book. At that time, I was reading Anne Rice, Queen of the Damned. As time went on, I started to get sleepy. I reached up to the zipper of my tent flap and looked over the streetlight that was directly in front of my tent. Standing there, directly under the streetlight, was a creature as tall as the streetlight. Well, maybe not as tall, but maybe a couple inches directly underneath the streetlight. Its hair was very long, and it looked a little hunched. I couldn't see any eyes because the hair seemed to be covering the front of its face. It was dressed in all black as far as I could tell, but what little skin seemed to stick out was white as chalk, and what little bit of skin I could see were its hands, which clearly went past its knees. The hands were just hanging there, and its nails were black. So black that they seemed to absorb the light. It just stood there, and it seemed as if the air surrounding it was vibrating. There was a type of static, it seemed, in the air. Now, don't get me wrong, I was very startled and afraid. I didn't know what this was. Then, suddenly, underneath the hair, I could see white starting to show. It was as if the creature was smiling at me. It stood there for a very long time, hands jerking just a little bit. Finally, as I was looking at it, something came over me. Now, you may not believe me, you might say the story isn't true, but I know that it happened to me. I grew angry, very angry. I felt a rage inside me, and it grew. I stared the creature down, and I got out of my tent and stood up. I looked straight at it and said, "I'm not afraid of you. You have no power over me." It seemed to make the creature laugh, and all that did was make me even more angry. I stood my ground and again told it, "I'm not afraid of you, and you have no power over me." I stood there staring at him for what seemed like the longest time, white-hot rage growing inside me, when all of a sudden I heard a loud snap behind me. I turned around quick to find out what the noise was, and there was nothing there. And then a thought suddenly occurred. That thing's probably behind me now, so I turned around quick again and looked towards the streetlight, and it was no longer there. I bundled up in my sleeping bag after it disappeared. I fell asleep again, but had nightmares about the thing standing over me, grinning and not being able to wake up and run. The next morning, I packed up my stuff and looked towards the streetlight where the thing had been standing. And there was blood on the street lamp pole. I no longer had that anger that I felt. I was afraid. So I gathered up all my stuff and got out of there as quick as I could. I headed to the highway, stuck out my thumb, and thankfully someone picked me up. I've never been back to Chickasaw Park since that night. I never plan to go back there ever again. Now, a word of warning. Be careful when you camp. You never know what you might come across. You might not believe what I've written, but it did happen, and it happened to me. Thank you for taking the time to read this, and if anybody may know what the creature could have been, comments are always welcome. Also, if anybody might know what it was that caused me to have the rage that I felt overcome me, comments are definitely welcome as well.